Lee's fingers drummed against his knee as he contemplated the device mounted beneath his aircraft. A massive spotlight drawing incredible power from the bomber's electrical system, waiting for its moment. For months he had championed this idea against skepticism and bureaucratic resistance. Tonight, everything would change. The Battle of the Atlantic was not going well for the Allies. German U-boats prowled these waters with near impunity, sending hundreds of thousands of tons of vital supplies to the bottom of the ocean. Merchant sailors lived in constant fear, knowing that a torpedo could strike at any moment, transforming their vessel into a metal tomb in minutes. The wolves of the sea, as the U-boat commanders called themselves, operated with devastating efficiency. But Lee had observed something crucial. The U-boats had a weakness, one that came from their very design. These submarines needed to surface regularly to recharge their batteries and refresh their air supply, and they did this almost exclusively at night, believing the darkness would protect them from Allied aircraft. The Germans had calculated correctly to a point. Conventional aircraft patrols during nighttime hours proved nearly useless. By the time a patrol plane spotted a surfaced U-boat in the darkness, the submarine's crew would have already seen or heard the approaching aircraft. They would crash dive in less than 30 seconds, disappearing beneath the waves before the plane could attack. Lee had spent countless hours analyzing this problem, sketching designs, running calculations. The solution, he believed, lay in a powerful spotlight that could illuminate a U-boat in the final seconds before attack, giving the submarine crew no time to dive while providing the bomber crew with a clear target. The concept seemed simple, but the execution proved extraordinarily complex. The spotlight needed to be powerful enough to illuminate a submarine from hundreds of feet above while the aircraft traveled at high speed. It had to be mounted in a way that wouldn't compromise the bomber's structural integrity or aerodynamics, and it needed to be operated with split-second timing. Many senior officers dismissed the idea as impractical. Some argued that the bright light would simply make the aircraft an easier target for anti-aircraft fire from the surfaced submarine. Others insisted that the power requirements would be impossible to meet without compromising other essential systems, but Lee persisted. He found allies among other innovative thinkers in the RAF Coastal Command. Together they refined the design, conducted tests, overcame technical challenges. The spotlight that emerged from this process was a marvel of engineering, a 22-inch naval searchlight capable of producing 50 million candle power, mounted in a retractable housing beneath a modified Wellington bomber. The strategy behind using the Lee light, as it came to be known, required extraordinary precision and nerve. The aircraft would patrol at night using radar to detect surfaced submarines from a distance. Once a contact was established, the pilot would approach with all lights extinguished, flying blind through the darkness, guided only by the radar operator's directions. At approximately 1 mile from the target, the aircraft would descend to attack altitude around 250 feet above the waves. The pilot would maintain course based on radar bearings, unable to see the submarine or even the ocean below. The crew would prepare depth charges, setting fuses, opening bomb bay doors, every man focused on his task. Then, at the crucial moment, when the aircraft was roughly 300 yards from the target, the operator would trigger the Lee light. In an instant, night would become day. A brilliant column of light would lance downward, illuminating a circle of ocean roughly 800 yards in diameter. And there, caught like an animal in headlights, would be the submarine. The U-boat crew would be momentarily blinded and disoriented. By the time they processed what was happening and began their emergency dive procedures, the aircraft would already be overhead, releasing its deadly cargo of depth charges. On that June night in 1942, Lee's aircraft detected a radar contact. The crew went through their practiced procedures, approaching in complete darkness. Tension mounted with each passing second. The radar operator called out ranges and bearings, The weapons officer stood ready. Lee kept his aircraft steady, fighting the instinct to strain his eyes, searching for visual confirmation of what the radar was telling him. 300 yards, 250. The moment arrived. Light on! The ocean exploded into brilliance. There, perfectly illuminated in the center of the light beam, was a German U-boat, its gray-green hull clearly visible against the dark water. For a frozen instant, Lee could see figures on the conning tower, caught mid-movement, as they stared up in shock at this impossibility, this miniature sun that had appeared without warning in the middle of the night. The depth charges fell away from the Wellington. The aircraft roared over the submarine. Behind them, columns of water erupted skyward as the charges detonated. The light clicked off, plunging the scene back into darkness. But the damage was done. The U-boat had no chance to dive. Later reconnaissance would confirm that this submarine never returned to base. The Lee Light had claimed its first victory. Word of this success spread quickly through RAF Coastal Command. More aircraft were fitted with the Lee Light system. Training programs were established to teach crews the unique skills required for this new form of warfare. Radar operators had to learn to guide their pilots with absolute precision. Pilots had to learn to trust their instruments completely, flying blind through the darkness until that final, brilliant moment of attack. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound and immediate. Submariners had grown accustomed to the relative safety of nighttime surface operations. They knew Allied aircraft posed a threat during daylight hours, but night had been their sanctuary, a time when they could run their diesel engines, recharge batteries, and transit at higher speeds without fear. The lead light shattered that sense of security. Suddenly, darkness offered no protection. A U-boat could be cruising on the surface under what seemed like perfect conditions, invisible beneath a moonless sky, when without warning a blinding light would appear and death would rain down from above. U-boat commanders began reporting sightings of what they called lightning strikes, or explosive lights. Some crews, blinded and disoriented by the sudden illumination, made errors in their emergency dive procedures. Others, recognizing they had no time to dive, would man their deck guns and fire desperately at the source of the light, but hitting a fast-moving aircraft while blinded by a powerful searchlight proved nearly impossible. The statistics began to shift. In the months before the Lee Light's introduction, aircraft sank very few U-boats during nighttime hours. After its deployment, the numbers climbed steadily. U-boats that would have escaped into the depths were caught on the surface and sent to the bottom. Merchant convoys, previously terrorized by night attacks, began to receive effective air protection around the clock. German naval intelligence struggled to understand what was happening. Early reports from U-boat crews seemed almost fantastical. Some commanders suspected their crews were experiencing hallucinations or combat fatigue. How could aircraft operate effectively in complete darkness? What was this mysterious light that appeared without warning? Eventually, German intelligence pieced together the truth. They recognized the threat posed by this new technology and scrambled to develop countermeasures. U-boat crews received orders to minimize surface time, to keep lookouts scanning the sky even on the darkest nights, to be ready to dive at a moment's notice. Some U-boats were equipped with additional anti-aircraft guns in the hope that they could fight off attacking aircraft. But this solution proved problematic. The time spent manning these weapons was time not spent diving, and in the seconds after a Lee Light illuminated a submarine, those seconds meant the difference between survival and destruction. The German Navy experimented with infrared detection devices that might give U-boat crews advance warning of approaching aircraft. These proved largely ineffective. They also considered equipping U-boats with their own searchlights to blind attacking aircraft, but this would simply make the submarine even more visible. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, recognized the severity of the threat. He issued increasingly stern warnings to his commanders about surface operations at night. Some U-boats began to submerge for longer periods, running on battery power, even when this reduced their operational range and effectiveness. But submarines could not remain submerged indefinitely. Eventually, they had to surface, and when they did, the Lee light aircraft were waiting. The men who flew these missions developed a unique set of skills and instincts. They learned to interpret the subtle variations in radar returns, distinguishing between a genuine submarine contact and the countless false returns generated by waves, drifting debris, or atmospheric conditions. They mastered the art of the blind approach, maintaining course and altitude in complete darkness based solely on instrument readings and the radar operator's guidance. The moment of light activation became the most critical second of each mission. Turn it on too early, and the submarine would have time to dive. Too late, and the aircraft might overshoot the target. The timing had to be perfect, a calculation that factored in aircraft speed, altitude, distance to target, and the submarine's likely reaction time. Crews also had to manage the psychological challenge of flying toward an unseen target in complete darkness. Human instinct screams against this kind of blind approach. Every fiber of a pilot's being wants visual confirmation, wants to see the target, wants to have more time to line up the attack. But the Lee light demanded absolute trust in technology and training. One pilot later described the experience as like flying into a black wall. The ocean below was invisible. The sky above showed no stars on cloudy nights. The only reference points were the faint glow of instruments on the panel and the voice of the radar operator calling out ranges. Then, suddenly, brilliantly, the world would appear in that column of light, real and solid and immediate, before vanishing again into darkness seconds later. The danger was real and constant. U-boat deck guns could be lethal, and in those brief seconds of illumination, when the aircraft was perfectly silhouetted against its own light, German gunners had a clear target. Several Lee light aircraft were damaged or shot down during attacks. Flak could tear through the thin skin of a Wellington bomber, wounding or taking the life of crew members or damaging critical systems. Weather added another layer of peril. Atlantic storms could appear with little warning, buffeting aircraft with violent winds and reducing visibility to zero. Ice could form on wings, adding dangerous weight and disrupting airflow. Mechanical failures in the harsh maritime environment were common, and all of this occurred hundreds of miles from land, over an ocean that would claim the life of any crew that ditched. Despite these dangers, the men of the Lee light squadrons persisted. They flew mission after mission, night after night, patrolling the dark Atlantic. Some missions lasted 8 or 10 hours, endless circuits over empty ocean, with nothing but the drone of engines and the green glow of the radar screen for company. Many patrols yielded no contacts at all. But the crews understood the importance of their work. Each U-boat they detected, each one they damaged or sank, was one less threat to the merchant convoys that kept Britain alive. Those cargo ships carried food, fuel, weapons, raw materials, everything needed to sustain the war effort. Without them, Britain would have been starved into surrender. The Battle of the Atlantic was, quite literally, a struggle for survival, and the Lee light crews were on the front lines of that battle. The technology continued to evolve. Engineers developed more powerful lights, improved radar systems, better depth charges. The Mark 24 mine, an acoustic homing torpedo nicknamed Fido, gave aircraft an even more effective anti-submarine weapon. Tactics were refined based on operational experience. Coordination between aircraft and surface vessels improved, creating deadly nets that U-boats found increasingly difficult to penetrate. By 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was turning decisively in favor of the Allies. U-boat losses were mounting while Allied ship construction was ramping up. The combination of improved convoy tactics, better anti-submarine weapons, breaking of German naval codes, and technological innovations like the Ley light created an increasingly lethal environment for submarines. German submariners began to speak of these waters with dread. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground where they stalked merchant ships with confidence, had become a killing zone where death could appear at any moment. Day or night, on the surface or attempting to dive, U-boats faced multiple threats from multiple directions. The psychological toll was immense. U-boat crews suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any service in World War II. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the German submarine force, roughly 30,000 did not survive the war. They faced an enemy that grew stronger and more sophisticated, while their own tactics and technology stagnated. And among the weapons that made their service so perilous, the Ley light held a special place in their nightmares. One captured U-boat officer, interrogated after his submarine was sunk by a Ley light aircraft, described the experience with haunting clarity. His crew had been running on the surface on a moonless night, recharging batteries after a long submerged patrol. The lookouts had seen nothing, heard nothing. Without warning, the ocean around them exploded into brilliant light. The officer's first thought was that they had somehow entered a minefield and that the explosions had illuminated their position. Then he saw the aircraft, silhouetted against its own light beam, already overhead. He shouted the dive alarm, but even as the klaxon sounded, he knew it was too late. The depth charges fell. The explosions lifted his submarine partially out of the water. Water poured through ruptured seams. The stern began to sink. Within minutes, the order came to abandon ship. He was one of the fortunate few who made it to the surface before his U-boat plunged into the depths, taking most of his crew with it. Stories like this became tragically common. The Ley light had transformed nighttime anti-submarine operations from a frustrating game of blind chance into a highly effective hunting technique. U-boats that might have survived to sink dozens more merchant ships were instead removed from the battle, their crews either at the bottom of the Atlantic or in prisoner-of-war camps. The impact extended beyond the immediate tactical victories. The mere presence of Ley light aircraft changed U-boat behavior throughout entire operational areas. Knowing that aircraft could attack effectively at any hour forced submarines to spend more time submerged, reducing their patrol effectiveness. It forced them to transit more slowly, consuming more time to reach and return from patrol areas. It degraded the morale of crews who could never feel truly safe, even under the cover of darkness. Wing Commander Lee, the man whose vision and persistence had made this possible, received recognition for his contribution to the war effort. But he would later reflect that the true heroes were the crews who flew these missions night after night, the men who trusted the technology and their training enough to fly blind into darkness, who faced enemy fire and mechanical failure and impossible weather, and who kept flying despite the losses. The Ley light missions continued throughout 1943 and into 1944. Even as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, the Battle of the Atlantic remained critical. U-boats still posed a significant threat, particularly the newer models with improved technology. But the combination of weapons, tactics, and innovations like the Ley light had decisively shifted the balance. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Ley light system had been credited with numerous U-boat encounters and played a role in fundamentally altering the nature of submarine warfare. It had proven that technology, applied creatively and courageously, could overcome what seemed like insurmountable tactical advantages. The lesson resonated far beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. Innovation matters in warfare. Conventional wisdom can be overturned. Problems that seem unsolvable often yield creative thinking and determined effort. One person's idea, properly developed and implemented, can change the course of history. The men who served on both sides of this struggle deserve remembrance. The Allied aircrew who flew into darkness to protect the convoys, and the German submariners who faced impossible odds in service to their country, all displayed courage in the face of terrible danger. War is ultimately a human tragedy, and the Battle of the Atlantic was particularly brutal, claiming tens of thousands of lives on both sides. In the cold waters of the Atlantic, hundreds of ships rest in silent graves. Merchant vessels, warships, submarines, all serve as monuments to the men who fought and perished there. The stories of their courage, their sacrifice, and the innovations that shaped their battles deserve to be told and remembered. The Lee Light itself was eventually superseded by other technologies. Improved radar systems, sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, and other advances continued to evolve anti-submarine warfare. But for a critical period in the middle of World War II, when the outcome of the conflict hung in the balance, this brilliant beam of light cutting through Atlantic darkness made a decisive difference. Today, few people outside of military historians and veterans know about the Lee Light. The device itself is preserved in museums, a strange-looking piece of equipment that might not immediately reveal its significance to casual observers. But to understand its importance, one must imagine those dark nights in 1942 and 1943, when the survival of Britain depended on cargo ships crossing the Atlantic, and those ships depended on protection from the U-boats hunting them. In that context, the Lee Light was nothing less than a lifeline. It was the physical manifestation of human ingenuity and determination. It represented the refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to question conventional wisdom, and the courage to implement untested ideas in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. Wing Commander Lee's innovation saved countless lives. Merchant sailors who might have perished in torpedo attacks reached port safely because U-boats that would have attacked them were instead located and neutralized by Lee light aircraft. Allied soldiers, supplied with the equipment and materials they needed to fight, owed their readiness in part to the cargo ships that made it through, because the Atlantic sea lanes were secured. The broader strategic impact is difficult to quantify, but impossible to dismiss. The Battle of the Atlantic was, in Churchill's words, the only campaign that truly frightened him throughout the war. Had the U-boats succeeded in cutting Britain's supply lines, the entire course of the conflict might have changed. D-Day might have been impossible. The bombing campaign against Germany might have faltered for lack of fuel and munitions. The outcome of the war itself could have been different. Against this backdrop, innovations like the Lee Light take on enormous significance. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, components of a comprehensive strategy to defeat the U-boat threat. But each piece mattered. Each innovation, each improvement in tactics or technology contributed to the eventual Allied victory. The crews who flew these missions understood this on some level, though they rarely spoke of it in such grandiose terms. For them, the work was more immediate and personal. They were protecting the merchant sailors who braved U-boat-infested waters to deliver supplies. They were doing their part, flying their missions, trying to survive long enough to make a difference. In squadron-ready rooms and crew briefings, the atmosphere combined professionalism with gallows humor. Crews would study intelligence reports, memorize silhouettes of different U-boat types, review attack procedures. Then they would climb into their aircraft and disappear into the darkness, not knowing if they would return. Some did not. Aircraft were lost to enemy action, mechanical failure, and the unforgiving nature of maritime operations. For the crews that did return, there was a unique camaraderie born of shared danger and shared purpose. They understood each other in ways that outsiders could not. They knew what it meant to fly for hours through darkness and storm, to trust your life to instruments and the skill of your crew, to experience that moment when the Lee Light flashed on and a submarine appeared in its beam. These experiences bonded them together. Years after the war, veterans of the Lee Light Squadrons would gather at reunions, and in their conversations, the old missions would come alive again. They would remember specific patrols, particular attacks, close calls, and successes. They would remember fallen comrades, speaking their names with respect and affection. And they would remember the feeling of having been part of something larger than themselves, something that mattered. The technological legacy of the Lee Light extended beyond World War II. The principles of coordinated radar detection and visual confirmation influenced post-war anti-submarine tactics. The concept of combining different technologies to overcome tactical challenges became a standard approach in military aviation. Engineers and tacticians studied the Lee Light system as an example of successful rapid innovation under wartime pressure. But perhaps the most important legacy is the human story. The story of persistence in the face of skepticism, the story of courage in the face of mortal danger. The story of innovation born from necessity, the story of ordinary men doing extraordinary things because their nation and their cause demanded it. Wing Commander Humphrey DeVerd Lee did not set out to become a historical figure. He was a RAF officer who saw a problem and worked to solve it. The fact that his solution proved so effective and that it came at such a critical time was in some ways a matter of fortunate timing. But it was also the result of clear thinking, technical expertise, and unwillingness to accept that a problem was unsolvable. His example reminds us that individuals can make a difference. Institutions and organizations are important, but within those structures, individual insight and initiative remain crucial. Someone has to have the idea. Someone has to fight for it. Someone has to prove that it works. Lee did all of these things. The crews who flew the Lee Light missions contributed their own form of heroism. They took an untested technology and made it work under the most challenging conditions imaginable. They refined the tactics through trial and error, often at great personal risk. They maintained their effectiveness through long months of patrol work, maintaining focus and professionalism even when missions produced no contacts and the work seemed monotonous. These qualities, persistence, professionalism, courage, and adaptability, are as relevant today as they were in 1942. The specific technologies and threats may change, but the human factors remain constant. Success in any challenging endeavor requires the same combination of innovation, courage, and determined effort that characterized the Lee Light story. For the German submariners who faced the Lee Light, the experience was nightmarish. They had trained to fight a certain kind of war, following tactics and procedures that had proven successful. Then the rules changed. The darkness that had protected them became meaningless. Their tactical advantages disappeared. They found themselves hunted by an enemy that could strike at any time, from any direction, with lethal effectiveness. Some adapted better than others. Experienced U-boat commanders tried to vary their patterns, to surface in areas where aircraft presence seemed less likely, to minimize time exposed on the surface. But the fundamental problem remained unsolvable from the German perspective. Submarines had to surface. When they did, they were vulnerable. The Lee Light ensured that this vulnerability could be exploited at any hour. The psychological impact of this should not be underestimated. Combat is always stressful, but there is a particular kind of stress that comes from facing a threat against which you have no effective defense. U-boat crews experienced this. They could not prevent Lee Light aircraft from detecting them. They could not escape once illuminated. They could only hope that no aircraft was nearby when they needed to surface. This kind of sustained psychological pressure takes a terrible toll. U-boat crews became increasingly stressed and fatigued. Some commanders began to make errors in judgment. Discipline problems emerged in some crews. The German Navy tried to address these issues with improved training, psychological support, and longer rest periods between patrols. But the fundamental problem remained. The U-boats were losing the Battle of the Atlantic, and innovations like the Lee Light were among the reasons why. In the final analysis, the story of the Lee Light is a story about how wars are won and lost, not through single battles or dramatic turning points alone, but through the accumulation of advantages, large and small. Superior technology, better tactics, stronger logistics, higher morale, all of these factors combine to create decisive superiority. The Allies possessed significant advantages in resources and industrial capacity, but these advantages had to be applied effectively. Innovation and adaptation were crucial. The Lee Light represented both. It was an innovative solution to a specific tactical problem, and its implementation showed the ability of Allied forces to adapt and improve their methods based on operational experience. This adaptability proved decisive. While German forces, and particularly the U-boat arm, tended to become more rigid and formulaic as the war progressed, Allied forces continued to evolve. New weapons, new tactics, new technologies appeared in steady succession. Each one made the submarine's task more difficult. Each one increased the odds that a U-boat would not return from patrol. The human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic was staggering. Over 30,000 Allied merchant sailors lost their lives, along with thousands of naval personnel. The German U-boat force, as mentioned earlier, suffered proportionally even higher casualties. Thousands of submarines were lost, taking their crews to the bottom. The Atlantic became one vast cemetery, its cold waters holding the remains of men from many nations. In remembering these events, we should honor all who served with courage and did their duty as they understood it. The men who flew the Lee Light missions were heroes, but so too were the merchant sailors who kept sailing despite the danger, and even the German submariners who fought with courage in a cause that history would judge harshly deserve recognition for their individual bravery, even as we condemn the regime they served. War is a collective tragedy. It calls forth both the best and worst aspects of human nature. It drives innovation and reveals courage, but at a terrible price. The story of the Lee Light reminds us of this duality. It was a brilliant innovation that saved lives, but it existed because the world was at war, and its purpose was to facilitate the taking of enemy lives and the destruction of enemy vessels. As we reflect on these events more than 8 decades later, we can appreciate the technical achievements and individual courage while also recognizing the broader tragedy of the conflict. The Lee Light story deserves to be remembered, not just as a tale of technological innovation or tactical success, but as a human story of people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, doing what they believed necessary for the survival of their nations and their way of life. Today's world faces different challenges, but the lessons from this period remain relevant. Innovation matters. Individual initiative can make a difference. Courage in the face of danger is still required. Persistence in the pursuit of solutions still brings results. The men who developed and deployed the Lee Light demonstrated all of these qualities. Their legacy is not just in the missions they flew or the U-boats they neutralized, but in the example they set. When facing seemingly unsolvable problems, when confronting determined enemies, when dealing with skepticism and resistance, they persisted. They believed that solutions existed and that finding them was worth the effort and risk required. This message resonates across the years. In our own time, we face complex challenges that can seem overwhelming. Looking back at how previous generations dealt with their challenges can provide both inspiration and practical lessons. The Lee Light story is one such lesson, a reminder that innovation, courage, and determination can overcome great obstacles. As night falls over the Atlantic now, commercial ships and military vessels cross those same waters in relative safety. The U-boats that once lurked beneath the waves are long gone, their remains scattered across the ocean floor. The Lee Light aircraft have all been retired, replaced by technologies that would seem like magic to the crews that flew them. but the story endures. In museums and history books, in veterans' memoirs and official records, the tale of how one pilot's innovation turned darkness into a weapon against the submarine threat lives on. It stands as a testament to human ingenuity, to the difference that individuals can make, and to the courage of those who flew dangerous missions night after night in defense of their nation. The beam of the Lee light that once cut through Atlantic darkness has long since been extinguished. But its illumination revealed more than just enemy submarines. It revealed the potential of human innovation to overcome tactical challenges. It revealed the courage of men willing to fly blind into danger. And it revealed that in warfare, as in life, persistence and creativity can turn apparent disadvantages into winning strategies. This is the legacy of the Lee Light, a story of how technology and courage combined to help turn the tide in one of World War II's most crucial campaigns. It is a story worth remembering, worth telling, and worth learning from. For in understanding how the men of that era faced their challenges, we better understand how to face our own. The Atlantic waters that witnessed these dramatic confrontations remain as they were, vast and powerful and indifferent to human affairs. But for those who know the history, those waters hold countless stories of courage and sacrifice. The Lee Light is one of those stories, a bright point in a dark time, a beam of light that represented hope and salvation for some and the end of the line for others. In remembering these events, we honor those who served, those who innovated, and those who sacrificed. We recognize that the freedoms and security we enjoy today were purchased at great cost by previous generations, and we commit ourselves to being worthy of their sacrifice, to facing our own challenges with similar courage and determination, and to ensuring that their stories are not forgotten as the years pass and direct memory fades into history. The Lee Light shone for only a few years in the vast sweep of human history, but in those years it made a difference that echoed across the decades. It helped secure the sea lanes that sustained Britain. It contributed to the defeat of the U-boat threat, and it demonstrated that innovation, properly applied, can shift the balance in even the most challenging circumstances. This is the story of the Lee Light, of the man who championed it, and of the crews who flew it into battle. It is a story of darkness and light, of danger and courage, of innovation and sacrifice. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, and in its remembrance we find lessons and inspiration that remain relevant today. The aircraft carriers of World War II may capture more attention. The strategic bombing campaigns may seem more dramatic. The great tank battles may appear more decisive. But in the cold waters of the Atlantic, in the darkness of countless nights, a different kind of battle was fought. And in that battle, a brilliant beam of light made all the difference. This was the Lee Light, and this was its story. The darkness was absolute. On the night of June 4th, 1942, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath Wing Commander Humphrey DeVerd Lee's Wellington bomber, a vast black mirror reflecting nothing but the faint glimmer of distant stars. The air inside the aircraft hummed with tension as the crew maintained their patrol pattern, scanning the waters below for any sign of the enemy that had been terrorizing Allied shipping lanes for nearly 3 years.